Hey guys, Matt Goodwin. Well, I just debated the BBC's Nick Robinson on the Political Thinking podcast, and this was a fascinating 40-minute discussion about the state of Britain, beginning with those riots and disturbances and protests in the summer, going all the way through our government's disastrous policy of mass uncontrolled immigration, through to woke ideology, through to my life history, and the background about our Substack community and why I'm investing in new media like YouTube and Substack over old media like the BBC. And the interview was lively, pretty spicy in parts. I went in there because I wanted, again, to give people like you a voice, but I refused to give an inch in this debate at all. And if you listen to the full thing, which you'll find below this video, you'll be able to sense the exasperation that is coming through my voice as I go through this interview. And also, I think, in some cases, the tactics that are used to try and discredit challengers to the elite consensus like me. And I'm going to show you just 3 clips here to give you a sense of the key moments in this debate and what we discussed. And we're going to begin with those riots and protests that erupted in the UK over the summer, what I call the immigration protests. And I was asked by Nick Robinson why, in a piece on Substack which went completely viral over the summer, did I point out that the guy who stabbed those poor children in Southport was the son of Rwandan migrants. And the point that I'm trying to make in this clip is that actually it tells us a great deal about immigration in Britain. Check it out.
Well, as I said at the outset, I think what's happened this summer is we've had a string of events which lots of people will have seen as being all symbols of the breakdown of our social contract, which have all really hung on this question of, are we an integrated country? Are we an integrated society? Are we doing all we can to integrate newcomers into our shared community and ways of life? And whether it's looking at young British Muslim lads assaulting police officers, whether it's looking at children from minority backgrounds stabbing British Army officers almost to death, whether it's machete-wielding gangs in Southend.
But forgive me, you're doing it again. You did it in the original blog. There's a whole series of unconnected events. It's a bit like, to be slightly facetious, it's a bit like me saying, Dr. Harold Shipman killed lots of his patients. Lucy Letby murdered lots of her patients. Therefore, we can't trust white medical staff, because these white British medical staff, they just keep doing it.
I'm saying we have a big problem in this country with a lack of social integration, with a model of multiculturalism which is failing. And 10 years ago, 15 years ago, you could say that without any controversy. David Cameron said it, Angela Merkel said it, Nicolas Sarkozy said it. I'm sure you reported on it at the time.
That's not the same as saying sons of immigrants are criminals. I'm the son of an immigrant.
Well,
am I a potential immigrant? Am I a potential criminal?
Hold on a second. First, hold on a second. The court case hasn't happened yet, but if you're implying that this guy isn't a criminal, then I strongly disagree with you.
I'm asking you to generalise from the specific point you made. You wrote a post saying who murdered them, the son of immigrants. As you say, nobody's been convicted.
No, I just simply said, as a matter of fact, that he is, as far as we know, based on information that is publicly available, he is the son of migrants from Rwanda.
And?
I think it's a significant point, alongside everything else that's happened.
He drives a Ford Sierra. He lives in a small house. What's he got to do with anything?
Because what followed in the days and weeks after that event, was a lot of unrest and disturbance and frustration and anger in this country that is not linked, I think, to a single tweet, but is linked to a collapse of social integration in this country and the effects of mass immigration on this country.
Now, I don't know about you, but as I said to Nick Robinson, the stabbings in Southport were clearly about our story of immigration, much like the Muslim lads beating up the police officers in Manchester, much like the member of a minority community who almost stabbed a British Army officer to death, because all of these cases actually hinge on the question of whether these people are integrated into our national community, whether they respect our rule of law, and also tell us much about second and third generation migrants who we know from research, who we know from lots of work in social science, tend to hold the characteristics, the beliefs, the values of their parents and their grandparents. And so I think that the fact that the alleged murderer in Southport came from a family that came from Rwanda, a conflict-ridden society, I think ultimately is a significant thing that we need to be able to think about and talk about freely. Now, clearly Nick Robinson had other views. But he also asked me what was the big turning point in my life where I went on a political journey. And I was quite clear in saying, for me, like many people in Britain, the Brexit referendum was a real line in the sand, not just because people voted to leave the European Union. That was fairly obvious and straightforward. But actually, what really changed my thinking was watching the reaction of the elite class to the rest of the country that had voted for something that members of that elite class clearly could not handle. Check this out.
I think the reaction to Brexit was one of the big moments for me, where I saw essentially many of the people around me, 90% of people in the universities, not to mention a lot of people in the national conversation, suddenly decide that half of the country, their fellow citizens, were racists and ignorant thickos and gammons because they happened to vote for something that the elite class didn't agree with. And they did that for good reasons. I didn't vote on the day of the referendum because I was analysing data for the media, because I was commenting on the results. But
looking back, it's an odd thing.
But
it's so fundamental.
But if I can just carry on,
you didn't bother to vote.
If I can carry on, the reason I became a black sheep was because, unlike 90% of academics, I stood up the day after and said, I think we should implement the vote. We should publicly accept this. And why did I do that? Because I believed that we should safeguard our democracy, and we should safeguard people's trust in democracy. Now, in the world of the universities, that put me in a very small minority. And what I then experienced was a few years of harassment, intimidation, bullying by academics who view EU membership and their support for large-scale migration as a sacred value, as things that you cannot question and challenge. Now, I did, openly. And the result of that was a pretty nasty wave of intolerance. So if you say, why did you change your views? That is a really big point in the story.
So as I said in that clip, what was striking to me as being a university professor in the UK is I was working in a sector of society in which 90% of all people who work in the universities had voted to remain in the European Union. They wanted to overturn the result of the 2016 referendum. Many of them did, and in fact, many of them went on to vote for Jeremy Corbyn to become Prime Minister in a Labour Party that was committed to holding a second referendum. And I thought this was outrageous. You know, I felt that for the health of our democracy, the sake of our democracy, it was critical that we didn't do what elites did to people in the Netherlands or France, where they forced them to vote again and again until they made the right decision. Why did I feel this way? Because it's a really important point. I believe that the true source of power, legitimacy, and authority rests with the people, with popular sovereignty. Elites have a fundamentally different view, which is what I was trying to point out to Nick Robinson, which is that elites believe the true source of power, authority, and legitimacy lies not with the people, but with other elites around the world. So the relationship is a completely different one. Elites subscribe to a horizontal relationship from one elite to another, whereas I subscribe to a vertical relationship from the elites down to the people. And it's that relationship, that social contract, that lies at that lies at the heart of our society. And that's why I felt respecting the vote for Brexit was so critical for our political system. But it wasn't just about what I experienced in the universities, where I did see many of my colleagues, including myself, being intimidated, harassed, bullied. And look, I can handle flack from other university academics, no problem at all. I will always push back as hard as people push back against me. But I did see many of my colleagues being chased off campus, being sacked, being shunned. I thought it was outrageous. But it wasn't just universities. This was also about the public institutions in this country. Now, I've already said in my last book, Values, Voice and Virtue, I've pulled together all the evidence and I've shown you how many of our public institutions, not just the universities, but government departments, the civil service, much of our media class, the publishing industry, museums, galleries, are dominated by people who come from the same educational backgrounds, went to the same elite universities, come from the same financially privileged families, tend to share the same values, the same outlooks. And I wanted to say to Nick Robinson, in the BBC, we have a fundamental problem, a massive divide between the people who dominate the institutions in our society, the institutions that shape how we think and talk about the country, and the rest of the people in this society who have to live with the consequences of the decisions that are taken in those institutions. Check it out.
Like most public organisations, the primary focus is diversity in terms of race, sex and gender, not diversity in terms of politics.
Yeah. No, look, I'm hearing your frustration. I'm hearing your anger. Will it take you into politics?
It's not just mine. This is, listen, let's be clear.
Sure.
No, Nick, let's
you've
be
been clear. There's lots of other people.
I want organisations like the BBC and the police to thrive in this society.
Yeah, and you want them to change. I
want them to be trusted. This is a really important point. Public trust in these institutions is collapsing. Yeah. There is a reason for that. People can see bias. They can see two-tier approaches to our conversations. Now, what I'm saying is, well, if you're going to run what I would consider as an academic to be a very political video, which is let's get into white privilege, which is drawn from critical race theory, it's not scientific, it's not backed up with evidence, you should, on the same page, run a video, what are the problems with this? But you don't.
I've heard it. Right, I don't run the BBC website, but people will have heard your suggestion. Given your anger, and it is true, and it's clear to me that you're angry and that you think you speak for many other people who are, isn't the next logical step to get into politics?
So what I was saying in that clip about the public institutions and the new elite class is that there is this void, this chasm between the rulers and the ruled. The people in the institutions and the people who have to live with the consequences of the decisions taken in those institutions. And this, to me, is one of the critical points. It means we need to reform the institutions. We need to change the way the national conversation is controlled in this country. And this really got me into the debate with Nick Robinson around how we perceive and talk about people who are challenging the elite consensus. Because if you're out there in the debate like I am, you're coming under an enormous amount of hostility. The old fighter pilots in World War II used to say that you're in the right place when you're getting serious flak, when you're above the enemy. That's when the fire is strongest. And that's what I discovered during this interview. I mean, I just want to play you a last clip regarding how Nick Robinson and others within the expert class perceive people like me who are challenging the elite consensus. Check this out.
Your fellow author, fellow academic writing that book, Revolt on the Right, Professor Rob Ford, described you as being on a sad, depressing journey whose final stations are Powell, Enoch Powell, of course, Griffin, Nick Griffin, and Tommy Robinson. Yeah. Is he right? I mean, do you now see yourself as drawing at least some inspiration from the writings of and the speeches of Enoch Powell, or not?
I think it's interesting. I don't want to make this personal like other people in the university class, but the person you referenced is a good example of what I've talked about. People in the universities have gone so far to the left that what they now do is they stigmatize anybody who challenges the elite consensus in this country by saying, oh, well, that person is another XYZ. Actually, as I said to you, everything I've said in this interview, let's lower migration. That's a 67% position in this country.
Forgive me, don't repeat all the positions because you said them, and we're not editing this interview.
It's an important thing because this conversation is actually reflecting why so many people are frustrated. Because what you're trying to say through
I'll tell you where listeners are frustrated. I think it's perfectly legitimate to say to you, there are parties throughout Europe, whether it's Geert Wilders or the AfD in Germany or Marine Le Pen. I think it's perfectly legitimate to say to you, Enoch Powell made these arguments decades ago, and ask you, are you with them or are you different? And if you are different, how are you different?
So sorry, is the question here, are you like a far-right party?
No, it's because are you different in your recommendations from them? Are you different from Enoch Powell?
I don't understand why this interview has become about Enoch Powell. This is reflecting the way the media class view these debates. It's a very bizarre interpretation. Most people in this country would agree with what I'm saying. The borders are broken. We have the levels of migration are too high. Law and order is not being controlled. The prisons are not working. These are majority views. What you are trying to do is stigmatize somebody.
I'm trying to put you a criticism raised by someone
why not use the conservative parties around the world? Why not reference a Republican?
I mean, this was the most revealing part of our discussion to me. I think it lifts the lid and it shows you how liberals, radical progressives, really see the world around them, because you have to pay attention to what's going on here. I'm critiquing mass uncontrolled immigration. It's a disastrous experiment. The evidence shows that. Immigration is taking more out of the economy than it's putting in. A lot of economists agree on that. Serious scholars like Robert Putnam and others have shown how mass immigration erodes social trust in society, reduces support for welfare, increases polarization, support for populism, and so on. And here I am critiquing the policies of the elite consensus. And for some reason, we're debating Enoch Powell, the conservative politician who, of course, made some pretty strident interventions on immigration. Why are we talking about Enoch Powell? Why are we talking about figures like Nick Griffin and others? Because in the strange world of the BBC and the universities, any criticism of mass uncontrolled immigration is now tantamount to what they see as far-right politics, as the revival of fascism, etc., etc. And this is a clear tactic that liberal left commentators and academics use, and you need to be aware of this, because what they're trying to do is discredit and undermine alternative viewpoints and challenges to the status quo. If you can discredit challenges as being dangerous, as being anti-democratic, as being racist, as being xenophobic, as being inflammatory, you can maintain control over the supply of information and the contours of the national conversation. And that is what ultimately things like the proliferation of hate crimes, of non-crime hate incidents, why liberals are inflating concepts like far-right, racism, hate. This is all designed to narrow the public square, to reinforce support for the status quo, and to discredit challenges. Because look, at the end of the day, everybody watching this video, including myself, right, we all have to look at ourselves in the mirror at the end of every day, and we know who we are inside, right, fundamentally. I look at myself in the mirror, I know I don't hold certain views that people ascribe to me, but what they're doing through these guilt by association games, this attempt at tarnishing the reputation of people, is they're trying to control the public square. Now, as I say in my Substack, recently on this interview with Nick Robinson, in the old media regime, where the old media gatekeepers and academics and experts dominated the flow of information, that strategy could work. But in this new media regime, where you and I are meeting on YouTube, or we're meeting on Substack, or we're meeting on X, that's not going to work anymore. They no longer control the supply of information. So what you're seeing, I would argue, in this interview, in this clip, is an increasingly desperate, frantic elite class that knows it's losing its grip over power, over the national conversation. It knows that the landscape is fragmenting. And that's what I find particularly interesting about that discussion to do with immigration and the challenging this elite consensus. So look, if you find this interesting, you'll get the full interview, the full discussion below this video. Thank you for tuning into this review. Thank you for supporting my work. Thank you for sharing these videos. We're all on a journey together. I think it's a really important journey. But what we're doing from one debate to the next, from one piece to the next, from one video to the next, is we're actually building this alternative ecosystem, this alternative culture. And remember, politics is downstream of culture. See you soon.